what I want to do is to I think concentrate on a few things in respect to Nicolas of Cusa. One thing is the breakthrough that he made in unlearned ignorance in respect to the nature of the physical universe. But at the same time, with Cusa, you have to actually discuss his concept of man and of the power of the human mind, because that's, as Lynn has been stressing, this is the issue of man's destiny, man's actual mission. And actually what he develops in terms of the nature of the physical universe is intricately related to the question of man's mission. And of course, in dealing with that, I'm going to deal with the major stumbling block which most people have in respect to the third book of Unlearned Ignorance, which is the question of Jesus Christ. A lot of people don't actually get through the third book, but it's absolutely essential to understanding what happened with the Renaissance and what Cusa's contribution to the Renaissance was. So let me just say that, of course, Joan of Arc was born in 1412 and was burned alive at the stake in 1431. So this overlaps Cusa's life, his early life. And of course, the Council of Basel began in about 1433. So it was just a question of 2 years after Joan of Arc was killed by the Normans, i.e. by the British. And as Lynn said, there was a reaction to that within the church at that time. And Nicolas of Cusa was clearly the person who put forward the conceptions which led to the realization of what Joan of Arc was fighting for, which was a sovereign nation state to begin with in France, which occurred under Louis XI, who actually met Joan of Arc before she was killed, and before he went on to create the first nation state that ever existed in the world. So, I mean, here we are at a point where the British Empire is launching aggressive war to destroy nation states, bring the world really back to the kind of condition, or even worse, than existed prior to the Renaissance, prior to the Council of Florence, where you had basically 100 years war. You had a reduction of the world's population by 1/2 through the Black Plague, through war, and so forth. And there were no nation states. They just didn't exist. And so you had a Venetian imperial system which ran amok in respect to humanity. This was a Zeusian system. And the advance which Cusa is responsible for, on the one hand, is that he gave the theoretical basis for the emergence of the nation state, of the sovereign nation state. This was in his book on Catholic Concordance, which was written basically within 2 years of when Joan of Arc was killed. It was presented first at the Council of Basel. And the key thing there is that he lays out there the idea that well, many of the ideas of the American Revolution. The idea that the government is by the consent of the governed. He lays out the concept that the government should be by election because of the nature of man, that he has free will. He also lays out that in that book that the basic problem is, as he put it, that the number of fools is infinite. And this is obviously promoted by the fact that there was no education. So you have a paradox. How do you have governed by the consent of the government, of the governed, if in fact you don't have a population which is educated? And his whole idea is that with a nation state, what you have to do is to educate the population, and he specifically develops the idea that you have to bring people beyond sense perception, beyond logical deduction, onto the level of creative reason. and that the only way that you can have harmony in the world, a Catholic concordance, which is the name of the book, is the extent to which people rise to the level of creative reason and are in harmony with the Word or the Logos. I mean, in the New Testament, it's usually translated as the Word, but the actual concept is the Logos. And that's his concept, and it's also expressed in on the Piece of Faith, which is his expression of an ecumenical approach as opposed to religious warfare, which we're also experiencing these days under the influence of the British Empire. So that's the first thing. Now, and when I discuss the third book of Unlearned Ignorance, I'll get more into that. But the basic thing is that what he was stressing is this question of imago viva Dei, that the only way out of a dark age, the only way out of perpetual warfare, which is what 100 years war is, and out of an imperial system, is the extent to which you foster that which characterizes man, which is his creativity. And he puts this forward in many of his writings. I'll just give you a couple examples. Let's see, this is on Conjectures, if I can find it here. Looking for the actual. Well, he says, conjectures must go forth from our minds as the real world does from the infinite divine reason. For since the human mind, the lofty similitude of God, participates as far as it can in the fecundity of the creatrix nature, it exerts the rational from itself as the image of omnipotent form in the similitude of real entities. And he actually has this idea of, it's an idea of that what man actually does is that he generates what are called rational entities. And that these rational entities are what Lin calls thought objects. I mean, that's the actual terminology that Cusa uses. This is the basis for then changing the physical universe, or actually developing the physical universe, which is the actual mission of man. And what he further develops, particularly in oh, here it is. It's on Barillas. He says, for just as God is the creator of real entities and of natural forms, man is the creator of rational entities and artificial forms. These are nothing other than the similitudes of his intellect, just as the creatures of God are similitudes of the divine intellect. Therefore, man has intellect, which is a similitude of divine intellect in creating. Therefore, he creates similitudes of the divine intellect. So the extrinsic artificial figures are similitudes of intrinsic natural forms. Hence he measures his intellect through the power of his works, and from this he measures the divine intellect as the truth is measured through its image. And so what you really have here is a concept of labor power, right? That man is actually measuring his intellect through the power of his works. I mean, it's a concept, I mean, it's not developed, but basically it's implicitly a concept of increasing energy flux density, and actually the validity of your intellect is the extent to which it's actually in harmony with the Logos, which and one of the key things that you haven't, many people have a prejudice against theology because most theology is completely Aristotelian and doctrinal. But the whole point that Cusa makes in writing on Learned Ignorance is that that he basically, let's see if I can find that he tried to find, he said that he had long desired to attain by various doctrinal approaches the truth, but could not. So, but the point is that theology is absolutely crucial to science. There's no division between true theology and science. Because what are you talking about? You're talking about the creation of the universe and the laws which define how the universe operates, and the extent to which man is in the image of the Creator, and has the mission of being the instrument for the further unfolding of the the physical universe, as that is enfolded in the Creator's mind, then I mean, how else can you deal with this but from a standpoint of a theology which is coherent with actual science? And that's really the point that Cusa makes. And he is completely opposed to Aristotle. Now, this guy John Hopkins, who translates Cusa, if you read many of his commentaries, will actually say that Cusa is Aristotelian. But I'm not, which is complete dishonesty, because he also translated John Wenck's book attacking Cusa, and he knows and also Cusa's response to Wenck. And in those, in his attack on Cusa, what Wenck actually says is the following. He accused Cusa of destroying the fundamental principle of all knowledge, namely the principle that it is impossible both to be and not to be the same thing, as we read in the Metaphysics. But this man cares little for the sayings of Aristotle. And then he says that Cusa's method is due to a meagerness of instruction in logic, and insists that Cusa's notion of the coincidence of opposites, quote, destroys Aristotle's entire doctrine. So he doesn't leave any doubt as to what Cusa does in respect to Aristotle, and yet Wenck persists in calling Cusa an Aristotelian, even having read this. And then Cusa's response is, but the Aristotelian sect now prevails. This sect regards as heresy the method of coincidence of opposites, yet the endorsement of this method is the beginning of the ascent into mystical theology. Hence this method, which is completely tasteless to those nourished in this sect, is pushed far from them as being contrary to their undertaking. Hence it would be comparable to a miracle, just as would be the transformation of the sect, for them to reject Aristotle and to leap higher. So I think his language is polemical, as you can see. He's not an academic. So it's sort of the polemical method of Lyndon LaRouche, going after this Aristotelian sect. So I think that's the one thing I wanted to just stress, is that this, Cusa is, I mean, when he left the Council of Basel to go to Greece to bring back the Orthodox Church, represent the Orthodox Church to Florence for the Ecumenical Council, he brought back with him the works of Plato. The only work of Plato that had been available in the West prior to that was the Timaeus, which was translated into Latin. That's the only one. So, and then there was a translation project set up in Florence, in Italy, after those works were actually brought back. So that is really crucial. Now, I would also just say that he makes the again, let's see where I can find this. He also points out, as does Plato, that the human mind is self-moving. And he derives that from, in theological terms, from the notion of the Trinity. But the point is that it's self-moving, and I'll get to that. But in the game of spheres, he says, the power of the soul is to reason, and therefore the power to reason is the soul. For this reason, the soul is the inventive power of the arts and of new sciences. So again, he's putting forward the... Can you repeat that again, please? The whole thing? Mm-hmm. The power of the soul is the power of the soul is to reason. That's to reason is the power of the soul. And therefore, the power to reason is the soul. For this reason, the soul is the inventive power of the arts and of the new sciences. So what you have here again is the concept of the unity of arts and sciences. Coming from what? Coming from from reason, from creative reason. That's the unity which defines both art and science. There's no division, as Lynn has insisted. Okay, so and then I'll just give you one other example of this. Let's see if I can find it here. This is from on the Game of the Spheres. I thought to invent a game of knowledge. I considered how it should be done. Next, I decided to make it as you see. Cognition, consideration, determination are powers of the soul. When I think, consider, and determine, what is happening except that the rational spirit, which is the thinking, considering, and determining power, is moving itself. Thinking generates consideration, and determination proceeds from them. They are but one living motion, moving itself perfectly. All right, so I mean, what he's got there is his explanation, and you get this also in St. Augustine, but basically his explanation, if man is in the living image of the Creator, and the Creator is triune, is a Trinity, then how is that reflected in the mind? And so both Augustine and also Cusa, among other Platonic Christian theologians, present that in terms of this self-moving quality of, in this case, thinking, consideration, and determination to actually carry out. But he's putting this in terms of an invention. So he's defining man's capacities in terms of invention. Because that's the only way you're going to get out of a dark age, and you have to create a nation state in order to create the conditions under which the population can actually rise to the level of creative reason, so that they can be inventive and transform nature, transform the universe. That's the basic idea that you have in Cusa, and that's the idea which really results in the explosion of population, which we've after the Council of Florence, which we've shown graphically in many of our publications, of an exponential growth in population and of potential relative population in general. Okay. Now, what I'd just like to, I think I'm going to jump forward to the question of unlearned ignorance. There's 3 books. The first is really about God. The second is about the physical universe, and the third is about man and his power in the universe, based on the concept of Jesus Christ. And the incarnation, right? That Christ is both God and man, and he's actually, if you really look at it, look at the Gospel according to St. John, which starts out by, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and all things are made through the Word. So, which is, I mean, it's no different than, I mean, in a certain sense, it's no different than Heraclitus. Because although Heraclitus said that the universe is characterized by change, this is not arbitrary change. I mean, Heraclitus says that the change is actually mediated through the logos. It's a developmental change. So, but that's the idea. And if you look at, when I get to the third book, the basic idea is that man, insofar as he imitates Christ in Cusa's concept, is actually, I mean, since Christ in Christian theology is the Word of God, or the Logos, through which all things are made, if man is imitating Christ in that way, and thus becomes Christ while still being himself individually, then he has that power. The powers of the Logos through which all things were created. Okay, so now I'm not going to go through the first book of Unlearned Ignorance at length. I'm going to actually jump more into the second book on the physical universe and its bearing on particularly Kepler and the whole question of the triad that Linus developed, with Cusa representing the maximum, and how that's reflected in terms of his influence on Kepler in particular. So, I mean, the first point is that Cusa makes a distinction between the absolute maximum, which is the Creator, and the physical universe, which is what he calls a contracted infinite. And the difference is that nothing can be precisely equal in the created universe, in the contracted infinite, because it's not absolute. So from that, he comes to certain conclusions. And again, I mean, think of the tyranny of thought which existed, in, throughout, centuries, throughout virtually millennia, of Ptolemy, of Euclid. So and within the Catholic Church, the Aristotle and the whole idea that that the universe is finite, effectively that it's entropic, that what you have from that creativity doesn't actually exist because all that exists is sense certainty and deductive logic, and the idea that the Earth is the center, center of the universe. The idea, I guess, which flows from linearity, which is that essentially a flat Earth thesis, even though it was proven a millennia earlier that that was not the case. So you had a tyranny, just as we have a tyranny of thought today, in terms of green ideology, in terms of entropy. And so, what does Cusa get at? First of all, he makes the point that since the universe is contractily infinite rather than absolutely infinite, it must be characterized by curvature, as opposed to linearity, which would be a characteristic of the absolute maximum. That's the first thing. Secondly, you cannot. He argues that you cannot have a fixed. There's no fixed point in the universe, because that would be an absolute. In other words, if anything were absolutely at rest, I mean, nothing can be an absolute rest because it's a created universe, a contracted infinite, and not an absolute infinite. Therefore, if you don't have any possibility of a point of absolute rest, then you can't have a center of the universe, a physical center of the universe, around which you could have circular orbits. Because to have a perfectly circular orbit, you have to have a fixed center. So he in the second book, he demolishes this idea of the Earth being the center of the universe, and at the same time, he demolishes the idea that there are perfectly circular orbits. All right. Now, he also addresses the issue of whether the Earth is spherical. And again, the point that he makes is, he says, let's see. He says, therefore, the shape of the Earth is noble and spherical, and the motion of the Earth is circular, but there could be a more perfect shape or motion. In other words, actually before that, he made the following point. He said, moreover, the Earth is not spherical, as some have said, yet it tends towards sphericity, for the shape of the world is contracted in the world's parts. So the point he's making is that the Earth is tends towards sphericity, but is not a perfect sphere. But in doing that, he's devastated the idea that, if anybody had this, that you've got a flat Earth, right? So what has he done? He's eliminated the flat Earth, idiocy, which obviously lends itself to taking a voyage to the West, if you hadn't thought about it before. He said that the Earth is not the center of the universe. In fact, what he argues is that there is no center and there is no circumference, physical circumference of the universe. That God is the center and the circumference of the universe. But then he further says that God is everywhere, but nowhere in particular. Right? He's not a physical object, but he is actually present. He, in a certain sense, subsumes or enfolds everything that exists. And then, of course, as I said, in terms of the orbits, he's basically argued against the circular orbit, which obviously was the whole the whole approach of Ptolemy, Copernicus and so forth, and he's eliminated the idea not only if you can't have an absolute point of rest, not only is the Earth not the center of the universe, but also the Sun is not the center of the universe. So you've eliminated, you basically criticized Copernicus in that respect as well. Now, furthermore, he basically develops the idea that the universe is anti-entropic, that it cannot perish. He actually says that where is it? The world machine cannot perish. But listen to this. This is because you think of the harmony of the world in terms of music. He says in the second book, in creating the world, God used arithmetic, geometry, music, and likewise astronomy. We ourselves also use these arts when we investigate the comparative relations of objects, of elements, and of motions. So I mean, he's introducing the idea of music in terms of how you think in terms of the relationships of objects, of elements, and of motions. Let's see, and he says, through music, he proportioned things in such a way that there is not more earth in earth than water in water, air in air, and fire in fire, so that no one element is altogether reducible to another. As a result, it happens that the world machine cannot perish. So his argument against, against the universe being able to perish and being entropic is actually based upon a concept of music. It's not elaborated, but obviously that's what Kepler does. All right, so I think, let's see, those are, I think, just sort of, so as you can see, it's not, I mean, he obviously leaves the door open then for Kepler, who cites him, in Mysterium Cosmographicum, but to realize positively what these relationships are in terms of astronomy, but negatively based upon an understanding of the contrast between absolute maximum and the contracted infinite. He has devastated all of these false assumptions. So it's a negative argument, but it sets up the possibility of progress. Now, what I would further say is, if you look at Cusa, everything he does is a paradox or metaphor. To give you one example, or two examples, what he's basically saying is that man, he says, man is a finite infinite. He says man is timeless time. So he's getting at this dual nature of man, which also flows from the concept of man as God-man, right? As in the image of the Creator. In terms of his creativity. So all right. So let me actually deal with this question of timeless time, because what he argues is man operates in, well, he says man operates in time, but when he rises to the level of creativity, he's in the simultaneity of eternity. He is actually, he's in a timeless domain, right? So when you think about that in terms of creative human beings historically, right, the kind of thing that Lynn has emphasized about being in a dialogue with people who are not even of your, immediate era, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, I've had sort of the experience that, if you look at, if you read Schiller's poem Columbus, and then you're thinking in terms of Nicolas of Cusa and Ferdinand Martin, who's one of the people who participates in Cusa's dialogues, and not other. And then and you can actually have the sensation of being, in a dialogue with all of those people over a span of time, which is timeless. But the point he's making is, when you are in a creative state, you're in a timeless domain, even though you exist in time. So it's timeless time. So let's see, I have one of these graphics which just sort of gets at this one here. Hopefully you can see it. And I just have to find where my okay. So this is he discusses this in a book called On Actual Potential.
Shift to the side a little bit.
So you can see it. You may not be all that clear, but basically what you've got is a top. This is typical of Cusa in terms of his effort to destroy sense certainty by getting you to think in a term which in terms which go beyond what your sense perception or your logical deduction. So here he has a top. Where did my here it is. Okay. So I'm just going to read through this one. So he says, let us describe a circle, BC, which is the top circle, which is being rotated about a point A, which is in the middle, as would the upper circle of a top. And let there be another fixed circle, DE, down here. Is it not true that the faster the movable circle is rotated, the less it seems to be moved? Suppose then that the possibility to be moved is actual in it, i.e., suppose the top is actually being moved as fast as possible. In that case, would it not be completely motionless? So again, another paradox that the maximum speed is motionless.
Why did he said why that would be in the? Can you say the beginning of his argument there again?
If it's moving, you're rotating it at basically at an absolute maximum velocity. He says, suppose then that the possibility to be moved is actual. This is his idea of actual potential. Suppose that the top is actually being moved as fast as possible. In that case, would it not be completely motionless? And this is the concept of rest and motion. That you can be at rest and in motion at the same time. From which is not the case from the standpoint of just looking at something in the finite through sense perception, because you can't see absolute velocity. It's a mental concept. If you try to conceive, well, what would it be to be absolutely spinning at an absolute speed? Well, in that case, it would be motionless because each point would actually be, at the same point all the time, and that's the idea. In that case, would it not be completely motionless? Since the motion would be infinite velocity, points B and C would be temporally present together at point D of the fixed circle down here. In other words, if this is absolute velocity, B and C will be simultaneously at point B, and therefore projected down, they would be at point D. For if B were temporally prior to C, the motion would not be maximum and infinite. If there's any temporality in this, it wouldn't be infinite. And yet there would not be motion, but would be rest, since at no time would points B and C move away from the fixed point D. Hence, the maximal motion would at the same time also be minimal motion and no motion. In that case, just as the opposite points B and C would be always at point D, would they not always be at the opposite point from D, namely at E over here? And this is eternity and this is time. That's the way he's doing this. So what he's getting at is that from the standpoint of God, an absolute maximum, God is present in all things without a distinction between past, present, and future. Okay, would this not likewise hold true for all of the intermediate points of the circle, BC? So it's not just BC, but every point here would be present both at D and E simultaneously. Therefore, the whole of the circle would at every instant be simultaneously present at point D. And the whole of the circle would be not only at D, but E. I'm sorry, not only at D and E, but also at every point, other point of the circle DE. Let it suffice then that by means of this image and symbolically, we are somehow able to see that if the circle BC were illustrative of eternity and the circle DE were illustrative of time, the following propositions are not self-contradictory. They're not Aristotelian. That eternity as a whole is at once present at every point of time, and that God as the beginning and the end is at once and as a whole present in all things. Because the other idea that Cusa has is that you have, which allows you to develop a concept of evolution, which is that that which is enfolded in the mind of God in the simultaneity of eternity is unfolded in time. And of course, the role of man is to be the instrument of the unfolding of that by imitating, as he puts it in the third book, Christ, who is the Logos, through which all things were created. Okay, then I'll just look. I'm not sure I want to go through this one, given the time factor, because I want to get to Jesus Christ here. But the point is, in the book, this is in on Barillas, so you can just look at it. But basically, I would suggest that this is this anticipates Vernadsky, and you just have to realize that Kuzansky had a big impact on Vernadsky. But the basic idea is three domains of three different domains. That is of essentially inorganic life and the noetic, and that essentially it's enfolded in the origin and then unfolded through. This is a folding process over time. Okay, so now just to get to the, I want to get to this third book, because as I said, this is a real sort of stumbling block for a lot of people.
I'm sorry, Will, can you take another couple of minutes on this?
Well, it's all right. Well, here's what he writes about this figure. Let the line AB, right, this line here, well, it's actually up there, which says first truth, and this says nothing. And there's a middle point C. Let the line AB be a similitude of the truth and stand between the first truth and nothing. Let B be the end of the similitude in respect to the nothing, right, so that's B. B should be folded over C in an enfolding motion toward A, and thus represent the motion with which God summons from non-existence into existence. The line AB is fixed, right? This line is fixed, so long as it egresses from the origin as AC. So the folding, the origin is AC, and movable so long as it is, so it's fixed here, movable as long as it is moved enfoldingly over C towards the origin, right? And this is what occurs through here. In this motion, CB with CA, right? So this is CB. This motion in respect to CA causes various angles. And CB unfolds by means of this motion different similitudes. First, it causes in a less formal similitude an obtuse angle, which is its being. Then in a more formal similitude an angle, which is its life. And then in the most formal and most acute angle, it causes its understanding. The acute angle participates more in the activity of the angle and in its simplicity, and is more similar to the first origin. Right. So the point is that the understanding is, as a more acute, participates more in the activity of the angle and in its simplicity, and is more similar to its origin. So the understanding is more similar to the first truth, i.e., the human mind is most similar to the Creator's mind. And it is in the other angles, namely in that of life and of being. Likewise, the angle of life is in that of being, and what intermediate differences there are between being and life and understanding, and what can be unfolded, you will see likewise in the enigma. So I just suggest, read through Ambarillas and, from that standpoint. Now, the point I'll make in terms of okay, so as I've said, what Cusa argues is that the human mind, the intellect measures itself by the power of its work in the physical universe, and it is engaged in the invention of arts and sciences. And the basic idea here is that, what is that the man is completely distinguished from a beast. Listen to this. Let's see. Animals lack the free will that is in us. When I invented this game, this is again from the game of the spheres, I considered, and I determined that which no one else thought, considered, or determined. Because each man is free to think whatever he wishes. In the same way, he is free to consider and determine whatever he wishes. This is why everybody does not think the same thing, because each person has his own free spirit. But beasts do not have this freedom. Therefore, they are impelled to do those things that they do by their nature, so that all the members of each species hunt and make nests in the same way. And he says, that animals are moved by the necessitating command of nature. Our regal and imperial spirit is not bound by this structure. Otherwise, it would not invent anything, but would follow only the impetus of nature. Okay, so in terms of, what you have to get here is the idea of, that he's putting forward in terms of Jesus Christ, is a concept based on the Christian theological notion of Christ as the second person of the Trinity, as essentially the Word of God, the Logos. And that he's putting forward the idea that if you imitate Christ, that you will actually have an increase in your mental power, right? Christ, as he's defining Christ, right? An increase in your mental power, which will give you power over, as at the end, this is, I think, very important. I referred to this before because it always has impressed me. But basically, the idea is that you will have power. Here it is. If the believer's faith is whole, then with the power of Jesus and with whom he is united, he commands even evil spirits and has power over nature and motion. And it is not he himself, but rather Jesus who, in him and through him, works wondrous things as the deeds of the saints bear witness. So what he's basically saying is, if you're participating in the Logos, i.e. Jesus Christ, then you will have power over evil spirits. You'll be able to defeat evil. You will also have power over nature. You will also have power over motion. Right? Think of that in terms of space travel with fusion and so forth. Whereas we'll have, it's that's the kind of thing he's actually talking about. And he says that that man can be elevated in this power over all things which are not Christ through union. All right, so the basic idea that he develops in here, and I don't want to, in a certain sense, I've developed the concept, but let me just get some of the. What he says is, well, let's see. There's a couple quotes which I think actually get, if I can find them. Here's one. Here, this is in On Conjectures. Man is indeed God, but not absolutely. Right. So he's. This is as opposed to Caesar, describing himself effectively as Zeus. He's not absolutely God, but man is indeed God, but not absolutely, since he is man. He is therefore a human God. Man is also the world, but not everything contractually, since he is man. Man is therefore a microcosm or a human world. The region of humanity therefore embraces God and the whole world in its human potentiality. Man can therefore be a human God, and just as he can be God in a human way, so can he also be a human angel, a human animal, a human lion or bear, or anything else. Within the potentiality of humanity, everything indeed exists in its mode. Everything then is enfolded in it in a human manner, since it is a human God. Humanity has the power to unfold everything within the circumference of its region, to exert everything from the potentiality of the center. Therefore, there is no other end of the creative activity of humanity than humanity. When it creates, it does not go outside of itself, but rather when it unfolds its power, it comes to itself. Nor does it affect something new, but rather all that it creates through unfolding, it experiences to have existed in itself. That this wonderful power traverses and proceeds through everything is not other than that it unfolds the universe in it in a human way. So, I mean, what you have here is a concept that I mean, you see the power of this, and how, which is generated by Cusa and the Renaissance, which is the power that we have to really mobilize. But it's based on this concept of man being in the image of the Creator, and in a certain sense, man, as he said, is a small world or a microcosm, and he has a responsibility. Well, in the Bible it says to exert dominion over the earth, but obviously that's over the universe. What Cusa is laying out is that, and in a certain sense, since man is the highest expression of the created universe, he unfolds everything. Whether it's inorganic life, and the noetic. So it's all three Vernadsky domains, right? But this idea you have in Vernadsky that Lynn's been emphasizing, that Vernadsky focuses on human life per se as the higher order concept. That is very clear in Cusa, and comes directly from this concept of man as a human God, right? Not absolute God, but as a human God who therefore has a mission and can actually create miracles. And when the word wondrous is used, which I just mentioned or read, I mean that's you're talking about miracles. I mean, in a certain sense, let's see, it's about. I'm going to wrap it up at this point, but the basic point I would make is, you have all of these people who are what do you call it? They're made into saints. I forget the word for it.
Canonized?
Canonized, yeah. But listen, I mean, and there's a requirement for for performing certain miracles or to be canonized. But my God, look at the miracle of in terms of Cusa. I mean, what he contributed to humanity, I mean, is really the power to make miracles, not in the sense of some particular occurrence.
Leading statue.
Yeah, but rather he basically conveyed the ideas which give man the power to create miracles of developing new arts and sciences, of continuing the process of unfolding what is enfolded in God's mind, within the universe as a whole. I mean, that's a miraculous power, and it's the the power of the human mind to create increasing, rates of energy flux density. The only other thing I would just say, which I, given the time limit, is that I would just stress that his work on the quadrant of the circle is absolutely crucial, because what he develops is the concept of a transcendental, which is really the concept that Cantor puts forward in terms of the transfinite. Right? That the circle is a different species than a polygon. It is a higher order species. It's a relationship between a circle and the polygon is a relationship between a cause and effect. And you cannot go from the polygon to the circle, but you can go from the circle, because it's higher order and transcendental, to the polygon. And now you have to think of the implications of that, of a transcendental process. And the basic point I would make is that what he did with the quadrant of the circle is the conceptual basis for the idea that man can make qualitative transfinite leaps forward in his power over the universe. So why don't I just end with that? I should give enough food for thought. Thanks.
You said that Heraclitus's change is mediated through logos. Is there more to what Heraclitus said?
Well, I think there was. I mean, it's a long time ago that I studied it, but the basic point is, if it's only a question of constant change, then what's the directionality? And the problem is a lot of his works are not fully available, so you don't have it all. But when I had studied this, probably back in the 1970s, what I discovered is that there was a concept of a logos, which essentially ordered the process of change. Because otherwise, you're just saying, well, the normal image is that the water in the river goes by, and it's always different. But there's a higher concept in terms of what he developed. It's a long time ago that I had researched that, but that's what I had actually seen when I was looking at it. Probably be found again, but it obviously makes sense that it would have to be. The change has to be, ordered. Otherwise, it's throwing a dice, which Einstein went after.
Hey, Will?
Yeah.
I just had a question, more historical. How was Cusa's work, I guess, received by the church at the time of his writings, and also the as it was cultivated throughout the Renaissance? How was that received by other sort of because I know he did a lot of outreach to other denominations, the Orthodox, looking at the Quran, and how it was received sort of historically throughout the European world.
Well, Cusa, he left the Council of Basel, which was, you sort of have to have the history. Before the Council of Basel, there was a council in Constance, I think it's called. At that point, there were 3 popes. So to resolve this situation, there was a council in Constance which forced all 3 popes to abdicate, and then they elected a new pope. But as a result of that, there was a school or sort of a school that basically said the council had authority, not the Pope. These were called the conciliarists, and that's what happened at the Council of Basel. Cusa left the Council of Basel, representing Eugene, and went to Greece. And by the way, one of the people that went with him was I think a brother of Ferdinand Martin, the bishop in Portugal, who was instrumental in helping Columbus. But basically, then he brought the people back from Greece to the Council of Florence. He himself did not attend the Council of Florence, but rather was deployed by the Pope to Germany to try to neutralize the German princes and make sure that they didn't side with the Council of Basel against the Pope. So that's the work that he was actually doing. He was later a bishop in a church in Italy, in the Tyrol area bordering Italy and Austria, and actually was thrown in prison by a local prince. He was in prison for some time because he bucked the prince's authorities. But then he rose to become the general vicar of the Catholic Church, which meant that he was the person in charge of the Catholic Church in the absence of the Pope. If the Pope was traveling, he was in charge. And one of the things he did is he convinced the Pope to allow him to call a general synod for the reform of the Church. And his basic idea was there was so much corruption that he wanted to have organized visitations to all the churches all over the world to basically root out the corruption. And he had a proposal for reform of the Church, which was based pretty much on the Beatitudes. But I cite this because he was obviously in a position of power within the Church. But historically, what happened is that he was attacked by Wenck, who accused him of being a pantheist. And if you read even today certain Catholic encyclopedias and so forth, they'll still refer to him as a pantheist. There are others who refer to him as a conciliarist, saying that he was with the Council of Basel and believed that the councils were more powerful than the Pope. And it should be noted that actually Wenck became an adherent of the Council of Basel, whereas Cusa had gone with the Pope. So he's attacked by this, and then when you had the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation, which tended to reinforce Aristotle, actually both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. You had his influence, I think, was weakened because he was not, when he put forward the general reform and had the synod. His response, the curia, the cardinals basically laughed at him. In other words, they were entrenched. I think that also led to his, led to the idea of a voyage westward, which didn't happen while he was still alive, but did happen, with the aid of the two people who were the executors of his last will and testament, Ferdinand Martin and Toscanelli. So his works were published, I think, in the early 1500s in Latin in France. How widely they were circulated, I don't know. I think it is probably the case that he had networks throughout Europe, including in Spain. And I think it's probably the case that the fact that Isabel supported Columbus probably entailed certain networks of Cusa or of his supporters in Spain, although I couldn't, document that at this point. But the point was that you had the Counter-Reformation, and I don't think you would have had the Reformation if Cusa's proposal for reform of the Church had gone through, but it was rejected by the Curia, which was controlled by the Venetian oligarchy, but there was an Aristotelian element there in terms of essentially the denial of free will, in terms of the Reformation, Luther and so forth. And then on the other hand, you had the Counter-Reformation in the Council of Trent, which was completely Aristotelian. So this is the kind of climate you had, and then of course you had religious warfare unleashed in Europe, including the Inquisition in Spain, but then just religious warfare, which continued really until the Treaty of Westphalia. So these elements had operated against Cusa. For instance, you can trace the effects of Leibniz on the American Revolution, and we have done that. But it is very difficult to find the direct influence of Cusa, even though his Catholic Concordance put forward the concept of government by the consent of the governed, which is in the it's in the Declaration of Independence, and that idea had never been expressed before that book in the history of the world. So, so the point is, the influence had to be there, but it's very difficult to see it. I think it's definitely the case that Cusa had an influence on Leibniz. Maybe that's could be proven more easily, but into the American Revolution it's just more difficult. So I would just say that somebody of this he was he was slandered. He continues to be slandered to this day. Some of the people in our own ranks, the Fernando Quijano elements and so forth, that from the 1970s, actually from the 1990s. They were completely opposed to Cusa, considered him to be a conciliarist, not sufficiently believing in the infallibility of the Pope. This sort of thing.
Ian sent in a question here.
Yeah.
He says, Ian Overton, he says, in Book 3, Cusa explains all these miracles, divine conception, resurrection, etc. And I was hoping you could be more specific in how Cusa's concept of enfolding creativity is supposed to explain these things physically. It makes sense in a purely intellectual concept, but not as a physical phenomenon, which is how I remember being discussed in Book 3.
No, well, for instance, no, I wouldn't. Well, don't look for some materialistic view of it. But for instance, I'll take the example of resurrection. He says, the resurrection of man occurs above all motion and time and quantity and other determinations, which are subject to time, so that the corruptible is resolved into the incorruptible and the animal is resolved into the spiritual. Accordingly, a whole resurrected man is his intellect, which is spirit, and the true body is engulfed by his spirit. And let's see, at another point, let's see. So the point I would make is that what he's doing is, he's saying the resurrected man is his intellect, and I think that's the whole point of. And he actually says that let's see, there's another point in here. Just a question of whether I can find it easily. And then, you just have to look at how he defines intellect. He said, again, the intellect is not temporal and mundane, but is free of time and of the world. The senses are temporally subject to the motions of the world. Senses which belong to the animal nature are incapable of attaining unto supratemporal and spiritual things. Therefore, what is animal does not perceive the things which are God, and God is spirit and more than spirit. I'm just trying to think. There was one more thing he said on this whole question of resurrection, that is essentially that maybe it's actually at the end of the second book. I mean, I look at it as no. I mean, what he, I mean, I think it's very clear. He's saying, I think he's making the same point that Lynn makes in respect to mind versus brain, because I think that's what he's getting at in terms of resurrection. That the resurrection, you know, is the intellect. The resurrected man is the intellect. And that the body actually, you know, dies, which would obviously imply also the brain, because it is part of the body. But that, you know, I look at it as really a question of the, in a certain sense, anti-entropic nature of the universe. That you know, that the intellect is what is the substance of man, and that actually is immortal. But I think you have to look at that from the standpoint of everything that I've otherwise presented in terms of his concept of man in the universe. So it's a if when you rise to the level of intellect, then you're actually above time, and you're in the simultaneity of eternity, and you're only in that state when you're in a creative state of mind, and you've gone beyond sense certainty and rationality. And I mean, I think that I think that that's really what he's talking about. If the resurrected man is his intellect, and everything he's discussing is rising to the level of creativity, so you can have this power over the universe for the purpose of, you know, really for the purpose of man himself and humanity in the universe. Then I mean, I think that's what he's getting at in terms of the resurrection. There's another thing in here, but I just can't. I think if maybe somebody else has something else, and I'll just see if I can find it. But I mean, I think at one point he actually says that that the universe wouldn't be the universe if resurrection didn't exist. So I think that he's getting at a certain quality, a certain anti-entropic quality of the universe, which requires the resurrected man, which is his intellect, as the immortal quality of the universe. So I mean, that's the best I can do at this point. Oh yeah, here's another part. He says, for suppose the following be granted, that if the motion of generation and corruption ceases, the perfection of the universe cannot occur apart from resurrection. Since human nature, which is an intermediate nature, is an essential part of the universe. And without human nature, not only would the universe not be perfect, but it would not even be a universe. So as I said from the beginning, when he said that he looked for answers to theological questions in doctrine and couldn't find it. So you know, his answers are not doctrinal, which is also, you know, probably why he is not popular among certain Aristotelian circles in the church.
You said in the De Barillo, did you say that he said that man's intellect is measured by his works, or the universe is measured by man's works?
What he says is that the intellect is measured. Let me find it. The actual quote is, man measures his intellect through the power of his works. And by that, I think it's basically, but it's his power of his works in respect to the physical universe. So it's the power of his works, the power on the universe of his works is a measure of the truthfulness and power of his intellect. So in a certain sense, I mean, it is a question of potential relative population density. You measure the power, and let's see. I don't have the full quote from Umberillis. No, actually, that's from the. No, I guess that is from the. Yeah, it's Umberillis.
It certainly sounds like.
Well, let me say. And then he says he measures his intellect through the power of his works, and from this, he measures the divine intellect as the truth is measured through its image.
It certainly reminds me of, and so you wish to learn all that economics, Linus says that economics is the the greatest of the sciences, or the highest of the sciences. Sounds like it's right.
Yeah.
From the same conception.
Yeah. He says that the truthfulness of any scientific discovery can only be determined by looking at its effect in physical economy.
The physical economy is the highest proof of science.
Right.
Yeah.
The power of science.
But of course, the physical effect. I mean, that's the way. Does it have a physical effect? That's the way you measure the truthfulness of what your intellect has put forward. And of course, he's saying that by measuring your intellect, you're actually measuring the divine intellect. Because think about it, I mean, the divine intellect has created the laws of the physical universe, and you are, the power of your works must be coherent with the laws of the universe, which you have discovered. All right, and then you've discovered, you've made a scientific breakthrough, and then you implement a technology based upon that. So if that scientific discovery is accurate, if your mind has made a truthful discovery, it's going to be coherent with the divine intellect, which has created the laws of the universe, upon which efficiency or effectiveness of your discovery, will be tested. So I mean, admittedly, it's a sentence, but the concept, is in advance of, what existed at the time that he was alive. But I think this idea of the top and the simultaneity of eternity is also important, because what you're getting at there is, Lynn emphasizes more now the future. I haven't actually, he has not emphasized so much the simultaneity of eternity, per se, but it's really the same concept. The only thing Cusa would argue is basically that the simultaneity of eternity means that the future, the past, and the present, as demonstrated in the top, are all simultaneously present in the mind of God. But what you've got to do, this is a concept of Leibniz. It's called the presumptive will. I think it's called the presumptive will of God. In other words, you have to. Man has the responsibility to discover the will of God. as best he can, and then to act on that. So so how can you do that unless you force your mind to think, at least in a similitude of how you can conceive God thinking. And so, for instance, if you take the first book of On Learned Ignorance and you take all of his paradoxes and metaphors, they're all designed to force you to rise to a level of imitation of God. In other words, when he's talking about an infinite circle, well, there is no such thing as an infinite circle. From a finite, if you're talking about a finite geometrical figure. So what is he doing? He's just he's getting you to try to conceive of infinity, absolute infinity, as a way of, and of course the word infinite means not finite. So he's trying to get you to think in a non-finite manner, in a non-sense certainty, clock time, non-deductive reason way. And when you're doing that, then you can approximate the simultaneity of eternity and have a concept of the future. Yeah, and that's it seems to me the basic thing he's doing, and that's where the power comes from. Being able to think in those terms, and then you're actually thinking in terms of being responsible for the universe as a whole, and that's where the power comes from. I mean, power for the good, power to defeat evil, and to develop nature, to further this unfolding process, which is enfolded in the mind of God. But this idea of man as a human God, that's as distinct from beast. That's really the fundamental concept that he puts forward, and is central to the Renaissance. So you see these. I mean, when you think about that, then you think about the self-portraits of Durer as Christ, self-portrait of Rembrandt as Paul. I mean, you think about it. These are very Promethean. I mean, to paint yourself as Christ, to paint yourself as Paul, is a very Promethean concept. But it gets at this idea of man as a human God.
If you think about that idea and the effect on art, it's not just that they. I mean, exactly what you said is stunning that they would do such a thing, that they would see themselves, be prepared to see themselves that way, man as a human God. But it's worth noting that Durer is credited with the first self-portrait ever, which he did when he was 13 years old. And he grew up in Nuremberg, maybe 30 years after Cusa died. But, I mean, before Cusa began his work, people didn't even see themselves as human, much less as a human God.
Yeah. So you have a universe which is defined by warlords and people being serfs. Mm-hmm. And you essentially have, it's sort of you have the remnants of the Diocletian system, mm-hmm. which is that you do what your grandfather, your great-grandfather, going back centuries did, and you don't have any other option. You don't do anything other than that. And you don't get it. You're not educated, and so, I mean, so the idea of being a human God. I mean, you can see where some people in the Catholic Church would regard that as virtually heretical, even though he says not God absolutely. But that's the concept that you needed to break out of. To break out of the destruction of humanity.
Mike Stegard has 2 questions. Just sorry, the first one said he had to jump off a few minutes once or twice, so he might have already covered this. But Cusa played a major role in rediscovering Plato while attending discussions in Greece with the Orthodox Church. Can you say more about that process and the transformation of Platonic thought in the context of the developing Renaissance by those such as Dante and Brunelleschi and then Cusa?
Well, yeah, so he left Basel at the request of Pope Eugene, who wanted to form an ecumenical council. And he went, he went to Greece, and he organized the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and others to come to the council, which actually didn't. I think most of the sessions were outside of Florence. They weren't actually in Florence, and they also the whole area, there was also plague and so forth. So it was difficult circumstances. But they stayed. So he brought back works of Plato, and I mentioned at one point, so maybe you missed that, the only work of Plato that was translated into Latin throughout hundreds of years was Timaeus, which is not a bad thing to have translated, but nonetheless, that's the only thing. So they brought them back, and there was a translation project in Italy. I forget the guy's name. We covered it, Fidelio, who was a key person who did these translations. But at the Council of Florence, they were there for some time because they had difficulty coming to an agreement. So they, and like the Greeks, at a certain point, some of them wanted to go back and break off the council and so forth and so on. But from what I can tell, they were there, and it led to a lot of just intellectual discussions. So I think there was a lot of, besides the translation of the works of Plato, there was also the discussions that took place. And so I mean, you think about it, it's really amazing that the works of Plato were not available because of the schism in the church, which goes back to what is it, 1088 or 1066 or something like that, when you had the division, and so it existed for those 400 or more years. And of course, the issue was so I think that obviously created the huge flowering in terms of the Renaissance. Of course, Dante is before this, so the extent to which I don't think he didn't have the benefit of all of those works of Plato. For instance, whereas Cusa, for instance, did have some benefit from this. For instance, one of his works is based very much on the Parmenides, but it's kind of funny because it was I'm not sure that he actually had the Parmenides. He had Proclus's commentary on the Parmenides, which is and Proclus is this Neoplatonic whose his ideas are not quite Plato's. You'd have to basically say that Dante and others before that didn't have the full access to Plato, but as a result of Cusa's trip, that was introduced into Europe. And of course, in Catholic Concordance, Cusa continued what Dante had done in terms of going after De Monarchia. It was posed in terms of if you take what Dante did with his work on the vernacular plus De Monarchia, and that was moving in the direction which Cusa then brought to fruition with Catholic Concordance in terms of the nation state. And of course, you need the vernacular language as opposed to Latin in order to move that forward. And I think another element in all of this was the Brothers of the Common Life, which was begun in the late 1300s, and that was an important effort because they were involved. Cusa, it's believed, was educated by them, as was Erasmus later, Obviously, Thomas à Kempis was associated with them. And the basic idea is that they were actually engaged in educating poor orphans in the urban areas. So you begin a process of education, which which was actually quite critical, to creating an intelligentsia or an educated population, minimally. So that was a big deal in terms of the transition to Cusa and so forth. But you think about it, it's quite amazing that Dante did what he did without having access to to all of these writings of Plato. But I think the translations actually occurred after the Council of Florence. So you're talking about after 1439, and it took some while for that to actually occur. And of course, the issue was the filioque, which at the Council of Florence, which again goes to the question of Christ, because what the issue is that the Holy Spirit proceeds not only from the Father but also from the Son. The Holy Spirit being love, agape, and so what you're really getting at, given that the second person of the Trinity, Christ, is the Word, or the Logos, is actually reason, and the Holy Spirit basically proceeds from not only the Father but from the Son. So again, it's the filioque concept, like Cusa's discussion of a human God, and so forth, is an emphasis on the actual power of the individual human being. And this had been denied by the Orthodox Church, and they actually looked at it as some sort of a aberration on the part of the Western Catholic Church. So they didn't actually. What happened at the Council of Florence is that they issued a proclamation finally, which unified the two branches of the Church. And the Eastern Orthodox agreed to accept the filioque as not some sort of heretical invention. It wasn't that they agreed to accept it themselves, but they agreed that it was not that it was acceptable. And they issued a proclamation about the filioque. So again, because this is the same issue as I've been discussing, and as Cusa is discussing in the third book. He doesn't mention the filioque, but it's the concept of man created in the image of the Creator, and the emphasis on creativity, and really the emphasis on reason and agape. And that's so. When you look at the questions, theological issues like the Trinity, that's a critical concept that individual man and imitating Christ, as Thomas Kempis puts it forward in his Imitation of Christ, is actually capable of acting on the basis of reason and agape, and that's the fundamental power. Because the other thing that just from a theological standpoint, you have this concept that you have what is it? I guess it's name is James. But the basic idea being that it's this question of faith. Are you justified by faith alone, which was the sort of the Lutheran standpoint, I think. But the theological idea was that yes, you are justified by faith, but the faith has to be a formed faith, which means a faith formed by works of love, which goes to this whole concept. Not just of particular acts of charity, but rather the fundamental work of love is what we've been discussing in terms of transforming the universe to realize the mission of man. And so the filioque went right at that question, and so it's, I think it's significant that was the fundamental issue which they discussed at the Council of Florence. But I think the other side of it is that they, at the Council of Florence, they undoubtedly had opportunity to discuss things like, geography, the nature of the planet, probably the whole question of questions which led into the voyage westward. Based on estimates of the size of the Earth and so forth and so on. Did I answer? I think I answered the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second one.
What was the second one?
I didn't read. I was seeing if anybody else had.
Oh, okay.
Michael Steger, the second question he asks, said, I recently attended a Russian Orthodox Mass, which to my discovery has kept the traditions of the Mass prior to the Council of Trent, which forced me to look up the Council of Trent. This then instigated thoughts on Russia's outlook of defending the true Christian faith against the guerrilla warfare of Shanita et al. The more interesting aspect is Cusa's influence on Vernadsky, and how Cusa was kept alive within Russian thought into the late 19th century. Going back to Cusa's time, there is also the resolution on the Filioque with the Russians, who I think were then murdered on their return. What do you know about the sense of Cusa in Russia over the modern period, and how it was sustained there while lost in the West? Was the Reformation and the British Empire Newton-Venetian party a factor in the loss of Cusa in the West versus the...
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, some of the Orthodox actually, I think, stayed in the West. Others who went back were all severely persecuted. For having made this agreement. I mean, it's not like there was mass communication. They could consult with people back home about what they agreed upon. So when they agreed upon it, which was based on reason, not upon, what the authorities back home insisted upon, they were pretty much wiped out. There was, they had a. And so in a sense, the agreement ended up falling apart within, maybe even within 10 years, in effect. No, I think, I actually, other than knowing that Cusa was, appreciated in certain circles, including Vernadsky in Russia, I don't have a background on that. Perhaps other people do. So I can't really, point to that. Obviously, to the extent to which you had a scientific intelligentsia, include, in terms of Vernadsky and others, they would be attracted to Cusa's thought. You do have, I'm not sure when these were set up. They're Cusanist societies in a number of countries, but they're very academic. And they don't want to be involved in politics, because when I got out of jail and had been doing the work on Cusa, I was in touch with the Cusanist Society in the United States, because they used my translation of On Conjectures as the basis for a seminar that they were doing. They're based in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. That's where they had their seminars. And the way it worked was it produced this book, and it was being sold in Cusa's birth house in Bernkastel-Kues in Germany. Mm-hmm. And so the head of the Cusanist Society in America went there, saw the book, looked at it, and saw that it included On Conjectures, which had never been translated in English before. Mm-hmm. And they were going to have a seminar on it, I guess was maybe some excerpts or what have you. So they asked permission to use this at their seminar. But, in my attempts to speak to them later, they were just really standoffish in terms of being afraid of becoming politically involved in any way, shape, or form. So clearly they didn't have a really Cusa concept of what man should be doing in the universe.
Right.
But but so I think his, it's interesting because, for instance, the first version of Unlearned Ignorance that I read was a translation that was done under one of the Roosevelt programs.
Wow.
Was it I forget the initials now, but one of the programs which actually hired people to do certain kinds of intellectual work, not just the building of dams and so forth.
Mm.
And then you also I think I mentioned this at one NEC meeting that one time I was out in the Tri-Cities area in eastern Washington, and they had a museum out there when Hanford was still up and running, and I was amazed. They had a timeline of a scientific timeline in the museum, which included Cusa, in this museum. So clearly, for people who are doing serious scientific work, Cusa's work would, particularly on Unlearned Ignorance, was probably being circulated, both in the United States as well as in Russia. So I think that, so I mean, maybe somebody else, I mean, I'm sure Lynn knows more about it, maybe others know more about it in terms of the influence of Cusa. I mean, how he was kept alive there, I'm not sure. As to, I think the filioque question is a weakness of the Russian Orthodox Church. But on the other hand, clearly Russia has not gone through the same kind of destructive, undermining of culture, which has occurred in the West, particularly since Kennedy's assassination. I mean, they have their own problems in terms of Marxist materialism and so forth, but they're, so you can see that they have tried to hold the line on certain kinds of values that have been thoroughly undermined in the West. But I think I think that they undoubtedly have continue to have the. I mean, in other words, the filioque is a fundamental concept, and if when the people who agreed to filioque went back, they were severely persecuted because the filioque is an anti-oligarchical concept, whether in the West or in the East, and I think that's sort of why in my introduction toward the Council of Florence, I suggested that this is really because the wall had gone down, but I suggested this is the time to rehabilitate all those people who were persecuted of the Council of Florence, and to think in terms of the actual question of the filioque from the standpoint of individual creativity as being the basis for economy and everything else. So so I can see that that they undoubtedly have resisted certain or certain elements of the Russian Orthodox Church. Undoubtedly have resisted certain aspects of what's happened in the West, but they I think they do have this this particular weakness. And actually, I mean, one of the things we did in the 1970s, there was an effort by the Episcopal Church and the British through the World Council of Churches to form basically an alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, which would have included eliminating, agreeing to being opposed to the filioque. So it was basically the Queen of England, who's head of the Episcopal Church, who was trying to engineer this thing. I don't think it actually took place, but there were discussions along those lines. So we found ourselves in a position back in the 1970s of defending the filioque at World Council of Church events. There was a big one in Vancouver, British Columbia in the 1970s that we went to.
Will, you raised a number of questions, but I'd be curious to know what you think people should. What more work should the organization be doing on Cusa? Or in other words, what's left undone? What should be? What do you think would be most valuable to uncover?
I don't know that it's.
Oh, sorry.
What are you going to say?
I was going to say we should translate on the mathematical concept. Is that what it's called? The companion to the theological complement. Sorry. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, please do continue. That's just.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have all of the. Xerox of all of the mathematical writings, but I think the most important mathematical writing that he did was on the quadrant circle. I mean, that's the one that represents the breakthrough. I mean, for instance, there are about, I think there's 3 or 4 others that he wrote on quadrature of the circle, which I translated, but they're not really of the same quality as this. In other words, the one on the quadrature of the circle goes right at this question of the transcendental. So it's the conceptually clearest. And I'm not sure that I mean, you could translate these. Maybe somebody else has actually translated them in the meantime. I'm not sure.
There's just one that we quote from in this article that we put out on violence in the golden section that I was looking at, and it quotes the mathematical concept and complement. The thing that I thought was really cool about it is it starts talking about degrees of knowability in the circle, sort of like Kepler's harmonies. So that's what provoked me, but maybe we can just translate that. Anyway, sorry, Daniel.
Well, the only other thing is, but maybe, despite his thinking Cusa's and Aristotelian, maybe Jasper Hopkins translated some of them. But the other thing which would be of interest is his sermons.
Yeah.
I just haven't followed it in some time as to whether more have been done, because you just find certain gems in those which are useful. But when I was in prison, I was basically I started out with on conjectures, and then I had like a 3 volumes of Cusa, which was the Latin and then but also German translation. So because I know German, but I also studied Latin in high school, I translated based on the Latin, but I used the German to help me, right, if there were any questions. There are useful things in the other writings, but frankly, the groundbreaking work is on learned ignorance. That's the one that stands out. It's even on conjectures, so it really pales compared to on learned ignorance. So, I think probably the most important thing is if you look at the other works, you'll get insights. I think, and there was you look at them all, and you get certain insights, including to on learned ignorance. So that the other works are useful, but they're not as groundbreaking. I think probably the most groundbreaking are the Catholic Concordance because of the whole question of the nation state, and then secondly which is the first thing he wrote, and then on learned ignorance, and then there are others that are very useful, but it's that's the most important one, really, historically. So I think the thing that needs to be done is for people to really master, particularly on learned ignorance. I think that's really the key thing, and also my experience is that a lot of people just have difficulty dealing, particularly with the third book, because of its theological nature in terms of Jesus Christ. So if you're not, so you may have prejudices which prevent you from seeing the thought content of what he's presenting in those terms. But it's really crucial that that people master that, because it really does go to everything that Lynn is saying. And I find that really what the overall framework of what Bernatsky developed is very much based upon Cusa. So really having a good grounding in Cusa is I think very important. So I mean, in a certain sense, I'm not so certain that there are things that we have to translate as our, in terms of our, as unfinished tasks in terms of Cusa. I think it's much more important, much more important task is making sure that people really grasp what he represents, what his ideas are, and so.
Anything else? No? Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.